A look today at Duke's Graham Barton, Oregon State's Taliese Fuaga, and Georgia's Amarius Mims. Three more offensive linemen spotlighted that the Dolphins could draft in the first round of the 2024 NFL Draft.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right. Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I am your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find our shows on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Tip of the cap to our everydayers because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. We are keeping it in the trenches here on a Monday. It is April Fool's Day, April 1st, 2024. No fooling with these offensive linemen, though. This is a no joke of an offensive line class. There is a lot of talent that's available. It's going to be a great opportunity for the Dolphins if the board breaks a certain way for them to add a piece that's a starter to their offensive line. And that, of course, amongst interior defensive line and potentially wide receiver 3 and potentially another safety, another edge rusher, depending on the health of Bradley Chubb and Jalen Phillips. That's kind of where everybody's attention's at right now with the Dolphins roster. So we did some of the heavy hitters at the end of last week between Troy Fautanu, we did Jackson Powers Johnson, and then we did Christian Hayes, a day 2 option at the offensive guard spot. I'd like to first acknowledge the heavyweight in the room, which is Joe Alt from Notre Dame. I did his evaluation over the weekend as well. That is an outstanding football player. If I could draft any one of the offensive linemen in a vacuum with no further recourse or consequence for opportunity cost or filling out a roster in its entirety, Joe Alt would probably be my choice. He is prototypical to the nines across the board. Had an outstanding year, former tight end, moved offensive tackle. That development and career path has had a lot of success for a lot of guys. And Joe Alt appears to be the next in line in that regard, but he will be long gone by the time the Dolphins come on the board at pick number 21, which brings us to the kinds of offensive linemen that we do expect are going to be available for Miami. And we'll start today's show with Graham Barton, offensive lineman. This is a very popular pick for Miami in a lot of mock drafts, just because he is kind of regarded to be one of the more positionally flexible players. The perceived offensive tackles that are going to be off the board by Miami picks is Joe Alt. Olu Fashanu from Penn State is general consensus expected to be off the board. Troy Fautanu is a coin toss from Washington, who was one of my favorite prospects for Miami in this year's class if he happens to be on the board. Graham Barton's kind of next in line, can play a number of different spots. It is worth acknowledging Graham Barton has played nothing but left tackle since 2020. 3 seasons. Every snap that he has taken this year has come courtesy of the left tackle position. Some people think he's a guard. Some people think he's a center. Some people think he's a tackle. The idea of tackle comes from, well, he's played left tackle the last 3 years for Duke, and he was really good when he did it, which is a factual statement. I thought his 2022 season was probably admittedly a little better than his 2023 season, just as far as the consistency and the splash plays for Graham Barton. But I did think, 3-year sample size of being a starter at left tackle in the ACC is kind of hard to thumb your nose at, especially when it turns out you're a pretty good functional athlete. His pro day numbers, he did not test at the NFL Combine, but he did measure in at the Combine. And I think this is where some of the interior conversation comes when it pertains to Graham Barton. 6'5", 313 pounds, good-sized offensive lineman. But he has sub 33-inch arms, and that's still good enough to play tackle in the NFL. It meets the thresholds that most teams are looking for, maybe not prototypical length, but sub 33, 32 and 7/8 inch arms amongst all NFL offensive linemen since 2000 at the NFL Combine. That's 24th percentile. It's in the bottom 25%. So the length there is an issue. And I think it shows up. I think Graham Barton, if I were to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of Graham Barton, I think one of the things that pops to me that you wish was a little bit more robust was the gravitational pull. And what I mean by gravitational pull is when I get into your sphere of influence, when I get into your wingspan, when I get into your blocking assignments, how easily do you not just engage with me and get your hands on me, but how do you sustain those plays? How do you retain those blocks? And he has the movement skills. He's got active feet, and he's an athletic offensive lineman. He can get out of the blocks in a hurry, and he can get out in space and play in space. But the gravitational pull is lesser, in my mind, in part because of the length, than some of the other players in the class. The other thing about Graham Barton that you maybe wish was a little bit more robust, and then we'll get into his strengths and what he does really well, is you wish there was a little bit more displacement. He plays the game with an edge, and I really appreciate the chippiness. I appreciate the enthusiasm to finish through the end of the whistle. I appreciate the strain that Graham Barton puts on tape. But if the Dolphins are looking for offensive linemen who are going to give you a little bit more consistent push and displacement, and that's what they want to continue to evolve as far as what they are up front on the offensive line, I do think Graham Barton, you wish there was a little bit more of that. You wish there was a little bit more knockback when he gets his hands on a first punch, as compared to he's a really effective clamp player with his hands. Once he gets his hands on, he gets a pretty good fit. And he's able to kind of lock up and use good upper body strength to really kind of lock in, and he keeps the elbows down. He's not out chicken winging, trying to control guys around. You know, he's in tight on his core, and you see that sustainability because of that. But you just wish there was more jolt or initial surge with Graham Barton's game. I think that makes him a very good zone blocker. And when you're trying to connect the dots, that makes a lot of sense for all the zone that Miami runs. They're not necessarily looking to run downhill at you. They're looking to create flow and displacement and have athletes that can get out of space. And Graham Barton can do that too. He's very nimble for a player. Like he plays like a 300-pound offensive lineman at 315. And he's a taller guy at 6'5". So it's very easy to be impressed with the movement skills of Graham Barton, the positional flexibility. He's played center in college early in his career at Duke. So there's some snapping experience on the resume. You play him inside at guard. He could probably feasibly play all 5 spots on the offensive line. I compare him most out of last year's offensive lineman to Peter Skoronski, who went 11 to Tennessee. But I think Graham Barton's a more dynamic, athletic player than what Skoronski is. Now, why would Skoronski go 11 versus Barton potentially being a candidate at 21? Some of that is the depth of the class. Some of that is the offensive line group in its totality. And some of that is other position groups that have a lot of needle-moving players. And some people look at the length here and say, well, you know, maybe this is somebody who's going to play inside for us at the next level. So the priority is not quite going to be there. And I do think Graham Barton, if you're looking for the succession plan of left guard to left tackle long-term for Teron Armstead's succession, I honestly think Barton's probably the easiest or the most direct plug in to that role. And then you could try to play it. My concern is I don't have as much confidence in Barton's ceiling on the outside in the NFL. So that, for me, might be a player that I think is more of a, you draft him to guard and he probably ends up settling at guard. I don't think he solves your long-term succession plan at tackle because, again, the sphere of influence and the length are things that I thought this past year showed up on tape. And for Miami, you know, the Austin Jackson ascension happened in large part because of the sphere of influence, the dynamic athleticism, and I think he's got a little bit more power than Graham Barton does. So it's almost a little bit more Isaiah Wynn-y, or where, you know, Isaiah Wynn was a tackle at first in the NFL, and seems to have found a better home at guard. I think the same would be applicable for Graham Barton, which makes him a perfectly fine candidate. If they drafted him, I would not be mad. I would see the vision. I would understand why he was the choice. But it wouldn't be the backflipping in to turn in the card of a Troy Fautanu, as an example. We're going to talk another powerful offensive tackle. Speaking of Troy Fautanu, we're going to talk about another Pac-12 or Pac-2, I guess now. Powerful offensive tackle in a Taliese Fuaga from Oregon State. Total butt kicker in the run game. We're going to talk about him next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins, so stick with us. The sports calendar is loaded as the calendar turns to April, and FanDuel is making it even more exciting to get in on the action because right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 that you can use to bet on the tourney, Major League Baseball, NBA, NHL, and so much more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn and make your first big bet a win with America #1 sportsbook. So we're going to talk next about Taliese Fuaga from Oregon State. This is a very large man. I think is probably the first thing that comes to mind when I think to describe Fuaga as a player. 6'5" and 3/4, 324 pounds, 33 1/8 inch arms. That is longer than Graham Barton, but still amongst offensive tackles, 15th percentile amongst offensive tackles. Amongst all offensive linemen, that's 34th percentile. I think that's something that shows up in Fuaga's game as well. In protection is the length. Now, I think he's as a larger framed player. I think he leverages inside out fairly well. As far as pass protection. But this is somebody who doesn't have the fluidity of a Graham Barton. And that's where for Miami, when they're assessing what direction do we want to go with our offensive line, I think that's an important question for them to have to answer. This is a 2-year starter for Oregon State. He was good in 2022. He made another leap this past year. And he is a violent run game defender. And I think that's the biggest difference in a good way for Fuaga versus Graham Barton. I think about Graham Barton and I think about the movement skills. I think about the strain that he plays with. We talked about kind of the lack of knockback, the lack of pop, the lack of power. I don't see that issue in any capacity for Fuaga because I think that's his best trait. It's just the raw power that he plays the game with is really impressive. Lower body explosiveness too. The jumps, we've talked about jumps the past couple of days, talking about offensive linemen and evaluating them and what combine testing matters for offensive linemen. 88th percentile in both the vertical jump and the broad jump for Fuaga at 324 pounds, which is 82nd percentile for weight. So your 80th plus percentile in size and your 80th plus almost 90th percentile in both of your explosive jumps. It shows up in a big way because this is a big dude, and he is mean. I think it's the KO blocks for Fuaga is one of the more exciting and fun highlight reels in college football this past season from an offensive line evaluation standpoint. He's right tackle exclusive. Let's start there. So I think that's for Miami. Drafting Fuaga means potentially, is that your starter at right guard to start? I actually think the ceiling's probably better at guard than it is at tackle. Because again, the length is kind of the same way. He's not as agile as Graham Barton is. So for Graham Barton, it was, we lack the length to really flash and steepen the angles on the edge, but at least we had the mobility to get out there, right? Where Fuaga is a little bit more of a longer strider player. His feet are a little heavier. His lateral redirection when he's in pass protection is a little bit more limited, and he doesn't really have a lot more length. He's got more pop in his hand, so he can kind of put off defending momentum a little bit. When the defender comes to his punch range, He's got the punch power to really offset and create the angles for himself. But just the anatomical strike zone that he has to work with his anatomical reach and length is not that much more notable than Graham Barton, a couple eighths of an inch. So I kind of find myself in the same boat where I think about Robert Hunt. And Robert Hunt coming out of Louisiana in 2020, we don't know what his testing numbers were because he didn't test, right? But he was a 6'5", 320-plus pound offensive tackle at right tackle who kicked inside and played guard. And Robert Hunt, I think just to have the full comparable, 33.5-inch arms at 323 pounds and 6'5". 6'5", 323, 33.5. Taliese Fuaga, 6'5" and 3/4, 324 pounds, so 1 pound heavier, 33 1/8 inch arms, so 3/8 inches shorter on the arm length than Rob Hunt. I think if you wanted to go a 1-for-1 and try to replace Robert Hunt, I'm not saying that Fuaga would be Robert Hunt, because there's a whole projection to the next level, leap that has to happen. The light bulb has to come on. Player development is not linear. It's not a 1-for-1. It never is. These are different people with different backgrounds and different life experiences and different hardships and different strengths. But if you wanted to draft a stylistic player to replace Robert Hunt, I think Fuaga is your guy in that regard. The valuation of that makes it challenging. He's not going to be on my hateful eight list, right? And that's courtesy of one of the listeners of the show who was like, hey, here's my list of guys I wouldn't trade down from 21 for. They're my hateful eight, which I'd hate to lose them, I guess, would be why you would call it the hateful eight. Fuaga's not on that list. Like, if Fuaga is amongst the players that is still on the board at 21, he wouldn't be a player that I would look at and say, wow, that offensive lineman is still there. We have to run in that card with his name on it. No questions asked. If Fuaga was amongst the players on the board at 21, my questions would be, okay, is X, Y, or Z on the board? Because if the answer is yes, some of those are offensive linemen. I have that as a higher ranked offensive lineman. I think there's a tackle ceiling that would exist for those players that I would really want to cash in on. And I think there's a higher ceiling for what they can be as players, never mind just the positional value. But if all those players are gone and the board breaks horribly and none of my hateful eight players is the players I would hate to miss, if none of them make it to 21 and Fuaga's on the board, I would ask, how many players do I have in the current tier that I feel comfortable with? And that number of players would define how far down the board I would be willing to go, and I'd be making phone calls. And I would let the value come to me a little bit and say, okay, I'm picking at 21, but if I have 7 guys in the same tier right now that I think are good value players, I'd be willing to go down 6 spots, right? And say, okay, is anybody want to come up and give us a 3rd round pick? And then I know I'm still going to get at least a player is going to be on the board because I didn't trade so far down that you could run all the players that I have in this tier of available talent. Now, if you're head over heels, you fall in love with them, then draft them. But I think the opportunity cost for me of Fuaga is I was a little bit surprised how I felt that there was a limited ceiling at tackle in spite of him having some prototypical tackle tendencies. I like him inside at guard, and that is a theme for the first 2 players that we've discussed here on today's show, Graham Barton and Taliese Fuaga. Those are players that have played tackle for the 5, but combined between the 2 of them in the last 3 seasons, they have 5 full-time seasons at offensive tackle as starters for their respective programs. And I'd like both of them better inside at the next level. Same cannot be said for Amarius Mims, but he brings his own unique challenges for his evaluation. We're going to talk about him as a candidate for the Dolphins and their 1st round pick up next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. Stick with us. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is sponsored by BetterHelp. A lot of us spend our lives wishing that we had more time. The question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you choose to use it, the best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make it a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters most to you so that you can do more of it. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist. And you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Shout out, by the way, to Raheem Mostert, signing a contract extension through the end of the 2025 season at the end of the week last week. Well-deserved. Max value on that contract's $9 million. Raheem was set to make about 3.5 this year. Got a little bit more than that in guaranteed money, some stipulated money. We'll see what the full terms of that contract look like. But a guy who's come in here the past 2 years and had consecutive career seasons with the Dolphins is obviously an impressive feat. And, even as an older player, the mileage that he's put on the last 2 seasons is a workload he's never had before. And he's been there and answered the call, and he's missed 3 games in the regular season the last 2 years combined for a guy who has an injury history that's difficult to ignore at the running back position. So glad to have Raheem Mostert under contract with the team through the end of the 2025 season, but just kind of gauging that contract as best as we can. I would assume there's a moderate pay grade upgrade for Raheem Mostert, and then the team will still have an exit opportunity after this season if 2024 is not a strong performance for Raheem Mostert. But excited for him to get the opportunity with a new contract. Our final offensive lineman we're spotlighting here today, though, is University of Georgia offensive tackle Amarius Mims. This is the built-in-a-lab type player that you see in person. I saw him at the Combine in person. And you just cannot believe this is a real-life human being. He is 6'7" 3/4", 340 pounds. Amongst offensive tackles at the NFL Combine since 2000, offensive tackles, that is 91st and 94th percentile. If you expand it to all offensive linemen, his height is 95th percentile, and his weight at 340 pounds is 96th percentile. His wingspan of 86 3/4 inches is 98th percentile of all offensive linemen at the NFL Combine since the year 2000. He has 36 1/8 inch arms. So we just got done talking about Graham Barton with under 33s. Now we got Taliese Fuaga at 33 1/8. Amarius Mims has 3 extra inches on his arm length than Fuaga. And 3 inches is no innuendos here, guys. But 3 inches is a significant amount of extra reach at the NFL when your strike timing dictates the corner that a pass rusher has to turn. Or if I'm getting in a run block situation and I got to get my hands set and we're both flowing horizontally at the same time, when I throw my hands, if I can get it synced where if I'm able to outreach you and I create the first contact, it gives me so many advantages. And that is a matter of inches. It's like the Any Given Sunday quote or the Any Given Sunday speech with Al Pacino. I'll spare you the Al Pacino voice, but I love the speech. I actually love that movie in general, but life's just a game of inches, right? And it's very relevant within the trenches where guys who have that freakish length, that's why it's coveted, is because of all the things it allows you to do. If you are able, he who strikes first wins. Mims has that element about his game. He is extremely powerful. He has the same broad jump at 340 pounds as Fuaga has at 324 pounds, which is 111 inches. That's 88th percentile for offensive line. At 306.7 3/4, almost 6'8" and 340 pounds. But it's how he carries 340. He's built like not an offensive lineman. Well, he is built like an offensive lineman, but the visual aesthetic of his frame, he's built like Tyron Smith, where you'd look at him and you'd be like, oh, it's a big guy, but you would be like, oh, he's not offensive lineman with having the thick torso. He's got the big broad chest, and he's got a lot of his mass that's well distributed, and that prevents him from being top heavy or having a big belly or anything like that. Like it's an incredibly graceful 340 pounds that Amarius Mims is. The challenge with Amarius Mims is very simple. If you look at his 2023 college football season, Amarius Mims played 297 snaps. If you look at his 2022 season, Amarius Mims played 383 snaps. And if you look at his 2021 season, Amarius Mims played 121 snaps. He has single-digit starts on his resume. And it was to the point where I'm looking to scout him in the midst of scouting Ladd McConkey and Brock Bowers and Cedric Van Granger, the center. And it's like, okay, I'll pop this game on. And he's on the field for the first quarter, and then he goes off. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'll go earlier in the season. I won't watch him play in this game. And he doesn't play in that game. And he had an ankle issue, and he had the tightrope procedure that Tua Tagovailoa had at Alabama. Mims had that procedure done with an ankle sprain. But it's always kind of just, and he was kind of weirdly buried on the depth chart. Georgia had a ton of depth early in his career at offensive line, but came in this year supposed to be the guy. He played in 7 games, so he played in half the season, but played less than 300 snaps. I don't think with his stature, he's a guard-specific player. I'd have a lot of apprehension about drafting Mims with the first-round pick. And it's not because of the talent, because I think the raw talent, I texted Joe Marino, who I co-host Locked On NFL Scouting with, in August when I watched the end of 2022 season. He started like the college football playoff games. I watched those 2 games. I'm like, who is this dude? Who is this absolute monster at right tackle for Georgia? And sure enough, it was Mims, and I just oozed the praise to Joe. But then this season unfolds the way that it does. And then his pre-draft process is interrupted because he has, I believe, a hamstring issue. So I'm just really leery. You're looking to have a long-term succession plan for an offensive tackle that deals with durability issues on an annual basis. And your answer is a guy who's never played more than 400 snaps in a season and has played less than 5, 6, like less than 800 career snaps in college. There's just not enough there for me to really have a lot of enthusiasm. Now, from a talent perspective, the 3 guys that we've went through today, I would have Graham Barton, 1, because I think he's a more versatile talent, but I grade him at on the inside for Miami. Taliese Fuaga, if you were to grade him at inside, he'd be right around where I have Jackson Powers Johnson, who I have graded as a guard for Miami because the snap issues. But Amarius Mims would be above both as a tackle. I think the other 2, when you grade them inside versus Mims at tackle, I think both are more attractive options than Mims if you kick them inside. But you don't really get I'd be excited about the addition of the talent, but I don't know where he would play for you in year 1. And you'd probably have to wait a while to get the clarity on what he's going to be as a player. Just because there's so many, he's so many reps behind. As just an example, right? I'm not a math guy, or I am kind of a math guy. I geek out over the salary cap and all that kind of stuff. But I'll do this. I got my calculator here. The last 3 seasons, 121 snaps in 2021, 383 snaps in 2022, and then 297 snaps in 2023. That's 801 snaps across the last 3 seasons for Amarius Mims. If you were to look at, say, Taliese Fuaga, this past season, he played 699 snaps. So he played 102 less snaps this year in 12 games than what Mims has in his entire career. Fuaga played 810 snaps in 2022. So the last 2 seasons combined, Fuaga has twice as many snaps as what Mims does in his 3 seasons at University of Georgia. Graham Barton Graham Barton this year played 492 snaps, but in 2022 played 895 snaps and then 747 in 2021. So you're talking about more than double the snaps as what Amarius Mims has been able to collect in 3 seasons. Let's do Troy Fautanu. Troy Fautanu, 894 snaps this year. It's almost 200 snaps more than Mims just this year versus last 3 seasons for Mims. And the year before that, Fautanu played 890 snaps. So you could go right down the list. I know Joe Alt's going to be another player that was a 2-season-plus starter for Notre Dame. 596 in 2021, 885 in 2022, and 697 in 2023. So that's just such a major extra incurred risk that I don't really have a great deal of appetite for Miami to bring on. But that said, the talent is undeniable. It would just not be maximizing year 1 of his presence with the team. So if I were to rank these guys in order of overall value to Miami, I try to grade guys where they're going to grade best. So Graham Barton, because he can play all 5 spots, I think grades out more favorably at interior offensive line, where some of the tackle questions don't exist. He would be the highest ranked of these 3 players. Taliese Fuaga would be the second highest, ranking him inside at guard as well. And then Amarius Mims at tackle would be my 3rd preferred option. So you take that and combine it with some of the guys that we've done already at the end of last week, and you can kind of start to piece together what my actual rankings are going to look like. But of course, we'll do all that as we get a little closer to the NFL draft itself, which is this month, as we are now into April. That is going to do it for us here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. Make sure you keep it locked in because it is your team every day. Make it a good one. I will be back again tomorrow to break down some more prospects that may be fits for the Dolphins at the end of the month.